Tonight, demands for accountability after 5 Palestinian women were forcibly strip-searched by Israeli soldiers. And India in a tight spot as Chinese and Russian presidents to skip the upcoming G20 summit. We cover stories about a human rights complaint against Edmonton police officers, Western pressure to halt UAE exports to Russia, and a report equating Canada's foreign workers program to modern slavery. Assalamu alaikum and good evening. This is Muslim News Canada on Muslim Network TV. I'm Zahra Syed. The UN is calling for an investigation into a disturbing incident in which Israeli soldiers forced 5 Palestinian women to strip naked during an apartment raid. The incident occurred in July in Hebron in the occupied West Bank. This act of humiliation has sparked outrage amongst Palestinian groups who are demanding that those responsible for this heinous act be held accountable. According to reports, during an early morning raid on the home of the Palestinian Ajlouni family, masked soldiers took the women into a room and forced them to strip naked. They released attack dogs near them to get them to comply. The victims include a 53-year-old woman, her 17-year-old daughter, and her 2 daughter-in-laws who are in their 20s. Although they had already removed most of their outer clothing, they were forced to strip completely naked. The soldiers used their guns to intimidate the woman and prevented male family members from intervening. The eldest son of the family was also arrested. The Israeli military says it conducted the raid based on intelligence information. It says the soldiers discovered a weapon and ammunition in the house. Forced disrobing and the use of attack dogs to intimidate Palestinians are used by Israeli occupation forces as a means of humiliation. Reports show such harrowing incidents have increased in the West Bank over the past year, further traumatizing Palestinian communities. Chinese President Xi Jinping will skip the upcoming G20 summit in the Indian capital of New Delhi. Indian Foreign Affairs Minister says Xi's absence has nothing to do with New Delhi's tense ties with China. This week, China announced that Premier Li Qiang, who has been in office since March, will represent the country at the meeting. China says that the relations with India are, quote, generally stable despite Xi's absence from the summit. However, the two countries have been facing tensions due to a number of issues. These include a border dispute, trade tensions, and India's growing strategic relationship with the US. Experts believe that some of this tension will overshadow the summit. The two countries will likely use the meeting to outwit each other and reaffirm their respective positions. India recently surpassed China as the world's most populous nation. The two countries are rivals in computers, steel production, space exploration, and other high-tech areas. The summit is an opportunity for the world's richest countries to come together and address some of the planet's most pressing challenges. However, the bloc is divided on its position on the Russia-Ukraine war. Reports have emerged that Russian President Vladimir Putin has decided not to video address the summit. Experts say the absence of Xi and Putin will make it difficult to arrive at a consensus leaders' declaration at the summit. 2 Black men from Alberta will be compensated following their mistreatment at the hands of the Edmonton Police Service. The compensation can be financial or non-financial. The news comes after the men filed a complaint with the province's Human Rights Tribunal for being pepper sprayed and arrested by the police in 2017. The 2 men had called 911 for help when a woman broke one of the men's car windows. The police arrived at the scene and immediately pepper sprayed both parties present at the scene. During a subsequent interaction, a second officer present at the scene said the men were lucky they were only pepper sprayed and suggested they could have been shot. The court is calling the remark discriminatory. The men are of South Sudanese descent. In 2018, the victims filed a complaint with the Police Service's Professional Standards Division for the conduct of the officers. Following the complaint, the officer received a disciplinary letter and was ordered more force training. The investigation concluded, calling the use of pepper spray necessary. Mavian Akot, a local community leader, calls the incident appalling but not surprising. Akot says members of the South Sudanese community have been racially profiled several times. The chair of Edmonton's Anti-Racism Advisory Committee says the case is an obvious example of discrimination. The police have requested a judicial review of the tribunal's decision. A hearing will be scheduled to decide on the matter. A report from Wall Street Journal says officials from the US, the UK, and the European Union are jointly pressing the United Arab Emirates to halt the supply of goods to Russia. These goods include computer chips, electronic equipment, and dual-purpose equipment. Dual-use goods have both civilian and military applications. Western officials fear that such exports could aid Russia in its conflict with Ukraine. The report says the visit by the Western officials to the UAE is part of a global effort to prevent the supply of dual-use products to Russia. The UAE has friendly relations with Russia. It has not imposed sanctions on Russia despite pressure from Western countries. Both the UAE and Russia are members of the OPEC plus oil alliance. Recently, the US has imposed restrictions on shipments related to artificial intelligence headed to the Middle East. The new restrictions come to the US's concerns of technology transfer to sanctioned countries. A UAE official has told another media source that the UAE strictly adheres to UN sanctions and maintains strict procedures for dealing with sanctioned companies. He says the government also actively monitors exports of dual-use products. For more on how the Americas are dealing with the painful legacy of Indigenous people, stay tuned. U.S. Interior Secretary Deb Haaland says Canada and the U.S. are working together to overcome the painful legacy of Indigenous peoples. Haaland says the two countries are in a joint healing process. Haaland is the first Native American member of the U.S. cabinet. Her remarks come during her first visit to Ottawa since she assumed her position. She says the history of residential schools and the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls is painful. Although Canada has been addressing these issues for years, attention in the U.S. increased significantly after 2018 when Haaland was elected to the House of Representatives. Haaland's personal connection to the issue through her grandparents' experiences in residential schools adds depth to her advocacy. Haaland says the discovery of unmarked graves in Canada triggered her to launch an investigation into the U.S. boarding school system. Estimates show that at least 500 students died at 19 identified sites. There are a total of 408 such sites. The investigation is ongoing, and a second volume of the report is pending. Haaland says a trilateral working group initiative launched in 2016 is addressing the issue of violence against Indigenous women and girls. It involves officials from the US, Canada, and Mexico. A former head of Israel's Mossad intelligence agency is calling the treatment of Palestinians in Israel, quote, an apartheid. Apartheid was a legal policy of racial discrimination of non-whites in South Africa, which was abolished in the early 1990s. Tamir Pardo's remarks reflect the views of a small but growing number of former Israel officials. Because of his previous rank in intelligence, Pardo's views carry great weight in Israel. Pardo says the resolution of Palestinian issue is of paramount importance for Israel, even more so than Iran's nuclear program. He has not clarified whether he held these beliefs during his time in the Mossad. Pardo says during his tenure as Mossad's chief, he has pressed Netanyahu to determine Israel's borders. He says he had warned Netanyahu that, quote, a country that has no border has no boundaries. In response to Pardo's remarks, Netanyahu's party is calling out on him for shaming Israel and its military. Rights organizations point to Israel's discriminatory policies, blockade of Gaza, and occupation of the West Bank. Human rights organization Amnesty International has last year accused Israel of committing, quote, the crime of apartheid against the Palestinians. Israel denies these accusations and attributes its treatment of Palestinians to security concerns. A 2017 report by the UN calls Israel an apartheid regime against the Palestinians. Last year, South Africa drew parallels to its own history of apartheid and called for Israel to be labeled an apartheid state. A UN expert has claimed that Canada's temporary foreign worker program is breeding ground for modern forms of slavery. The news comes after Tomoya Abakata, the UN's special rapporteur on contemporary forms of slavery, concluded his 14-day visit to Canada. Abakata calls the reports of exploitation and abuse by migrant workers deeply disturbing. Abakata says temporary foreign workers on employer work permits are vulnerable to exploitation. He says migrant workers cannot report grievances without fearing deportation. He's calling out on the Canadian government to provide a clear path to permanent residency for all migrants, prevent exploitation, and protect workers' rights. Abakata says the communities most at risk of modern slavery and exploitation are those already facing discrimination and violence. These include people with uncertain immigration statuses, Indigenous peoples, people with disabilities, people of African descent, and people who have already been incarcerated. Thank you for watching. Our news is produced by Sound Vision, which is a not-for-profit organization. We need your support for donations. Please scan the QR code on our broadcast or visit muslimnetwork.tv to donate now, so we can continue to amplify the voices of Muslims in Canada and abroad.